Quick review, in case you've forgotten things since Friday. We were talking about dispersion forces and how in even an atom, a small atom like helium, the electrons can be unevenly distributed just randomly. And so you get an instantaneous temporary dipole on this atom, which induces a dipole on the neighboring atom because this side of the atom is partially positive, and that attracts the electrons in the neighboring atom. And there's a force of attraction here that's called a dispersion force. Then this one has a dipole, and so it induces a dipole over here, and then everything goes back to normal. And these happen just instantaneously, very, very briefly, and then they go away. So very weak. So these are transient. They constantly appear and disappear. The magnitude of the dispersion force depends on how easily the electrons can polarize in response to one of those instantaneous dipoles. And that depends on the size of the electron cloud. Whoops, that's not what I meant to do. So your book doesn't talk about this, but I think it's helpful to at least look at this equation. So the force of attraction between two electrical charges is equal to this. This is called Coulomb's law. It's Q1 is the charge on one object, and Q2 is the charge on the other object. And this is divided by the distance between them squared. So if you increase the charge on the objects, you increase the force of attraction. So when that atom is more polarized, meaning the partial negative charge on one side is larger, then the force of attraction is greater. Does that make sense? Higher charges, more attraction. And the amount of polarization depends on the size of the electron cloud. So a larger electron cloud is more easily polarized. An analogy to help you remember this, I don't remember if I mentioned this one to you or not, because I forget. So going to the fair. Did I talk about that, taking kids to the fair? So if you have one child and you go to the fair, or you have 6 children and you go to the fair, who's more likely to lose track of your children? The mom of 6, right? So, yeah, I've temporarily misplaced some of my children, but I always found them in the end, and I know where they are right now. They're not all necessarily where they're supposed to be, but I know where they are. Larger electron cloud, those electrons are farther from the nucleus, and there's a lot more of them, and so larger molecules, larger atoms are more easily polarized. So the force of attraction is larger between them. So molar mass is not the only factor determining the magnitude of the dispersion force, but it can be used as a guideline. So if we're comparing similar molecules, similar kinds of molecules, or similar kinds of atoms, you can look at the molar mass as a measure of how large that particle is. So let's look at this. These are noble gases, helium through xenon. And if we look at their molar mass, we see that the molar mass of these atoms is increasing. And we learned from trends in the periodic table that as we go down a group, the radius of the atom increases. And so we see that same trend with the molar masses. And then let's look at the boiling point. The boiling point is going to be a reflection of the strength of the dispersion forces. These are all atoms. The only force of attraction that atoms have is this dispersion force. And so if the dispersion forces, if the stick-togetherness between the particles is greater, then they need more energy to be able to break free. Does that make sense? When something is boiling, the particles have enough energy to escape from the liquid state into the gas state. So if the boiling point is low, that means they're not very sticky, and you don't need much energy to get away. If the boiling point is higher, the molecules stick together more, the intermolecular forces are greater, and it takes more energy, because temperature is a measure of kinetic energy. So here we see that helium has an extremely low boiling point, 4 Kelvin. That's just 4 degrees above absolute zero. So all of these are really low boiling points, but we see that xenon, being a larger atom, has a larger boiling point. So we can compare boiling points and see that as an effect of differences in the dispersion forces. Any questions? So you should be able to answer questions like this. Which hydrocarbon has the higher boiling point? These are similar molecules. They're both just carbons and hydrogens. Which one do you think is bigger? CH4 or C2H6? C2H6 is very reasonable to say, well, that's the bigger one, right? Because its molar mass is greater. So this one is larger. Another clue is they both have the same 2 elements. C2H6 has more of both of them. So it just stands to reason that that one's larger. So a larger molecule, is that going to have stronger dispersion forces or weaker? Stronger, because it's more easy for that cloud to be pushed around. Stronger forces, is the boiling point going to be higher or lower? It's going to be higher. It's stronger forces, the molecules are more sticky to each other. And so in order for them to get loose, they need more energy. Okay? That's how you reason out a question like that. And that's how I think of it. I mean, maybe some of you can just memorize stuff, but I have never been successful at memorizing things like that. So that one's larger, so this one has the higher boiling point. Okay, so you should be able to answer questions like that. Another type of force is called a dipole-dipole force. The dispersion forces are present in all atoms and all molecules. Dipole-dipole forces exist in all polar molecules. They do not exist in nonpolar molecules or in atoms. Polar molecules have permanent dipoles. The helium atom can have an instantaneous dipole, it can form, and then it goes away again. In a polar molecule, there's always a positive end, and there's always a negative end. So this type of attraction is the same, but it's constant instead of coming and going. So the dipole-dipole force is the attraction between the positive end of one permanent dipole and the negative end on another. So all molecules have dispersion forces. Polar molecules also have these dipole-dipole forces. Dipole-dipole forces are always there. Do you think those are going to be stronger or weaker than the dispersion forces that come and go? They're going to be stronger, right? Because they're always there. They're not there just sometimes. Dipole-dipole forces are stronger. So do you think polar molecules are going to have higher boiling and melting points or lower than things with just dispersion forces? They're going to be higher, right? In general. Because their stick-togetherness is greater. They're more sticky to each other. So this is a molecule called formaldehyde. This is its structure. There's a carbon, double bonded to an oxygen, and then single bonds to 2 different hydrogens. And if we looked at the Lewis structure for this, I need to put some electrons in here. So the Lewis structure, this oxygen would have 2 lone pairs on it. The carbon has its 8 valence its octet of electrons there, so that doesn't have any. So we look at this and we could say, well, there's no lone pairs on the carbon, but the atoms bonded to it are different. This oxygen is different than the 2 hydrogens. That makes this a lopsided molecule. It makes it a polar molecule. Because here this oxygen is more electronegative, and the hydrogens are less electronegative. And if you look at that, you can just see that it's lopsided. One end is different than the other, right? This end is different. So one end's negative, one end's positive. So if you get 2 of these anywhere close to each other, The negative end of one is attracted to the positive end of the other. There's a force of attraction. That's the dipole-dipole force. Attraction between two dipoles. Dipole-dipole force. So again, the strength of the intermolecular force is going to affect boiling and melting point. So we can compare formaldehyde and ethane. And so you look at those two and you're like, I don't know how big they are, but let's look at the molar mass. Well, their molar masses are almost exactly the same, even though the formulas are different. These are going to be similar in size. When we look at their structures, we just looked at formaldehyde. This one's going to be lopsided, right? It's not symmetrical. This one is very symmetrical. There's no lone pairs anywhere. And these carbons are just bonded to hydrogens around the outside. This is a nonpolar molecule. Nonpolar molecules only have dispersion forces. Polar molecules have dispersion forces and dipole-dipole forces, so stronger intermolecular forces. The boiling point for formaldehyde is minus 19. The boiling point for ethane is minus 88. Stronger intermolecular forces, higher boiling point. The same is true with the melting point, minus 72 versus minus 92. Minus 92 is a higher melting point. See how that works? So polarity of molecules affects their melting and boiling point. It also affects how they interact with other molecules. So miscibility. Miscibility is the ability of a liquid to mix with another liquid. So polar liquids are generally miscible or mixable with each other, but they're immiscible with nonpolar liquids. So if you think of oil and water. You can't rinse oil or Crisco off your hands with water. It just doesn't dissolve in the water. It doesn't mix. So here's a couple pictures. This one is pentane and water. There's a model of the pentane there. So the pentane is nonpolar and water is polar. They don't mix together. Here's oil and vinegar, which is, mostly water. They don't mix. You get an oil spill. The oil sits on top of the water. It doesn't mix with the ocean water. So why do they not mix with each other? Okay, we'll stay there and talk about it. Well, water is polar, and it has dipole-dipole forces, and they're attracted to each other. And the oil does not share those interactions. So the water molecules are held together more tightly than the oil molecules are. And so the oil can't get into the water because the water's held together so tightly. In order to make a hole in the water for the oil to get in, you have to break some of those interactions, and then you better replace them with something, or it's just going to get squeezed out. So another polar liquid like alcohol can come in and push its way into the water and replace those dipole-dipole interactions that the water has, because the alcohol can also do that. A little bit like, you get a bunch of Japanese people and a bunch of Swedish people in a room, and none of them speak a common language. And are they going to socialize real well? No. The Swedish people are going to stand in little clumps and speak Swedish to each other, and the Japanese people are going to stand in little clumps and speak speak Japanese to each other, right? They don't speak each other's languages, and so they tend to exclude each other. It happens with people, it happens with molecules. So you can think of the type of intermolecular force as being a little bit like a language. And so if the two liquids do not speak the same language, they will not mix. Just a review of how to decide if something's polar or not. The book's method: determine whether the molecule has polar bonds, and then look at its shape and decide whether the polar bonds add together to form a net dipole moment. Most students don't like that method. They're like, I don't remember how to do that. So here's my method. Works most of the time. You do have to be able to consider the Lewis structure. But a molecule is nonpolar if both of these things are true. They both have to be true. No lone pairs on the central atom, and the atoms bonded to the central atom are either all the same or they have the same electronegativity. Most of the time, they'll just be the same or different. So, determine whether each molecule has dipole-dipole forces. So we're going to use my method because this is my class, and I like my method better. So we do need to think about the Lewis structure. So carbon tetraiodide, that's Ci4, not Cl4. So it's going to have a, that's not very useful, black. Let's go with pale yellow. It's going to have a carbon in the middle and 4 iodine atoms around it. And those iodine atoms have lone pairs on them, but we don't need to think about them. What we're looking at is the central atom. It's bonded to 4 different atoms. Are there going to be any lone pairs on the carbon? No, it's got its octet. We're not going to do anything where octets are violated for this. So carbon does not have a lone pair. That's the first condition. Are all the atoms bonded to the carbon the same? They are. So this is a symmetrical molecule. It's that tetrahedral shape. Okay, so it's like a, well, it's a tetrahedron. It's the hardest shape to communicate to people. Anyway, it's symmetrical. There's not one end that's different than the other. So this is a nonpolar molecule. Do nonpolar molecules have dipole-dipole forces? No. A dipole-dipole force is an attraction between 2 permanent dipoles. This molecule doesn't have a dipole. It's only going to have dispersion forces. So we say no, this does not have dipole-dipole forces. What about CH3Cl? Well, the carbon's going to be in the middle again, and there's going to be 3 hydrogens around it, and 1 chlorine. Again, we can look at that central atom. It's bonded to 4 things. That gives it its octet. So it's not going to have any lone pairs. No lone pairs. Are all the atoms bonded to the central atom the same? No. The chlorine's different, right? So it's symmetrical in terms of the atoms being spread out, but one of them's different. And so this makes this a polar molecule. This one's polar. Do polar molecules have dipole-dipole forces? Yes, they do. HCl. Well, that's a diatomic molecule. Diatomic molecules are real easy. If the atoms are different, assume that it's a polar molecule. So this one's polar. Does it have dipole-dipole forces? Yes, it does. Okay, so that's the sort of question that you should be able to answer. Any questions? The last type of intermolecular force is hydrogen bonding, which is kind of a misleading name because it's not really a bond. Hydrogen bonding is like super dipole-dipole forces, like Superman. It is a dipole-dipole force, but it's just an extreme one. And so this happens when you have an extrapolar molecule. And that happens when you've got a hydrogen atom that's bonded directly to fluorine, oxygen, or nitrogen. Those are the 3 most electronegative elements. And they're small, and the hydrogen is small, and this allows them to get close together. Coulomb's law says that the force of attraction depends on the charges. If the charges are higher, the attraction is stronger. And if the distance is closer, it was divided by distance squared. If that distance is short, then the attraction is bigger. If the distance is greater, the attraction is less. So these molecules are able to get closer together because their atoms are small. So how can you remember this? Well, do you remember the movie E.T.? What did E.T. say? E.T. phone home. Whoops. Kind of ruined the moment there. Phone home. So you can have hydrogen bonding if you have hydrogen bonded to nitrogen, oxygen, or fluorine. Is that a good one? Personally, I like that one. E.T. was an awesome movie. Really sad things. I was in high school when that came out. It was really awesome in the theater on the big screen. Very, very cool. So, molecules, polar molecules that have one of these bonds, hydrogen to nitrogen, hydrogen to oxygen, or hydrogen to fluorine, will also have hydrogen bonding. Hydrogen bonding is the strongest intermolecular force because it's like super dipole-dipole forces. And it's not just enough that you have hydrogen and one of these other elements in the molecule. They have to actually be bonded to each other. So here's an example with hydrogen fluoride. So here we have a hydrogen-fluorine bond. So that's one of the phone home combinations. And so this bond is going to be extrapolar because the difference in electronegativity between these two is great. It's greater than normal. And so this partial negative charge is larger than the normal partial negative charges. So you say, well, how much is it? Well, let's just say maybe this one's a third of a whole charge. And on the other ones, maybe it's, 1/12 of a charge. So the charge is still less than 1. It's not ionic. But it's closer, it's greater, and so the force of attraction is different. It's larger. And so this attraction between the fluorine on one molecule and the hydrogen on another is what's called the hydrogen bond. But it's not actually a bond like a covalent or ionic bond. So methanol does this as well. Methanol, we've got carbon here bonded to 3 hydrogens. And then we've got a bond to oxygen and a bond to hydrogen. So here we have that hydrogen-oxygen bond, a polar molecule with a hydrogen-oxygen bond. And so this partial positive on the hydrogen is attracted to the oxygen on a neighboring molecule, and that's a hydrogen bond. So it's the same thing as a dipole-dipole force, attraction between permanent dipoles. It's just that the dipoles are extra strong. And so it's given its own name, hydrogen bonding. So again, we can compare melting and boiling points. Here's methanol. Methanol has this, it's easier to look at in the structure, this hydrogen-oxygen bond, and it's polar. And here's ethane. And these two are similar in size. We can gauge that by looking at their molar masses. But this one is very symmetrical. There's no lone pairs or anything, and there's definitely no oxygens. So here, methanol boils at 64 degrees, which is well above, it's like double body temperature. It's getting up close to water, which is 100. And ethane boils at minus 88 degrees. That's a huge difference. This is a nonpolar molecule. It only has dispersion forces. Methanol has dispersion forces, dipole-dipole forces, and hydrogen bonding. These molecules stick together more strongly than the ethane molecules, and that's reflected in their boiling points. Water also has hydrogen bonding. So water's got hydrogen-oxygen bonds, and so we get this force of attraction between the hydrogen on one and the oxygen on another. And this is why water has some really unusual properties. The boiling point of water, we've learned, is 100 degrees Celsius. And that just seems normal to us. But compared to other compounds of similar size or similar groups in the periodic table, it's really, really unusual. Well, yeah, we'll talk about that in the next section. Hydrogen bonding is really important in a lot of physiological processes. This is an illustration of DNA. So DNA consists of two long strands. They're molecules. They're just really, really long. And they form this double helix. And they are attracted to each other and held together by hydrogen bonds. So some of you know more about DNA than others, but there are four base pairs. There are four bases in DNA. There's thymine, adenine, guanine, and cytosine. I'm not going to test you on this. This is just an illustration of the significance of hydrogen bonds. But all of these have the potential for hydrogen bonding. So here we've got nitrogen, hydrogen, and that can be attracted to the oxygen over here. These two will pair together because they can form 3 hydrogen bonds. And in the DNA, it's really important that they pair up in the same way every time. Otherwise, you get genetic problems, which can lead to death and all sorts of horrible things. And these two will form 2 hydrogen bonds. And so in the DNA, what happens is the DNA gets taken apart and replicated. And that's how your body keeps making more. As you make more cells, each cell needs some DNA. And it makes proteins and enzymes and all kinds of cool stuff, using this as its pattern. And so it's really important that the DNA be copied exactly correctly every time. And so you pull these apart and it makes a new strand on this one and a new strand on that one. And it does that because these match up in the same way all the time. And it's all hydrogen bonding. Hydrogen bonding is really important. This is just a summary of the 3 different types of intermolecular forces that we've talked about. Any questions? So dispersion forces are the weakest. Dipole-Dipole forces are in the middle, and hydrogen bonding is the strongest. So here's a question. Which has the higher boiling point, HF or HCl, and why? Do you hate it when they ask why? Can't I just guess? Well, let's look at these two guys. What kind of forces does HF have? Well, they all have dispersion forces, right? Let's maybe call that DF. Is that a polar molecule? Yeah. So then it also has dipole-dipole forces. Does it fit the ET phone home? It does. So it also has hydrogen bonding. Then let's look at HCl. That has dispersion forces because everything has dispersion forces. Is that polar? Yeah. You've got 2 different elements bonded to each other, hydrogen and chlorine. So it's going to be polar. Polar molecules have dipole-dipole forces. Does it fit the ET phone home? No. So no hydrogen bonding. Which of these 2 has stronger intermolecular forces? The HF, right? So this one has stronger forces. Stronger forces mean the molecules stick together more, and so they need more energy, they need a higher temperature to escape. So this will have the higher boiling point. Do you see how you think that through? Higher boiling point. Why? Because it has stronger intermolecular forces. It has hydrogen bonding, the other one does not.